Hello, everybody. I am Kevin Rogers. I'm the director of Reasonable Faith Adelaide. And tonight we have Declan Ellis, and he's going to present a talk on the untold history of science, a Christian perspective. And Declan is from Perth. He's a member of the Perth chapter, and he works as an apprentice for AFES at Curtin University. And among his other things that he does, he teaches a bit about apologetics. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Declan.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Apologies if my voice gets a little bit scratchy. I'm still recovering from a cold, so bear with me. But yeah, thank you for signing in. Let's get underway. So, in the popular animated TV series Family Guy, there's an episode where the characters work out how to travel between worlds. And the first world they travel to looks just like the future. It's super scientifically advanced. There's flying cars. AIDS has been cured. You don't even need to go to the toilet to poo. It turns out that this is not the future at all. The difference is, in this world, Christianity never existed. Now, you might think, what kind of a difference does that make? And your answer probably depends on how you view Christian history. In Family Guy, one of the characters explains that this alternative world looks so utopian, it looks like the future because the Dark Ages never occurred. Now, in case you're not familiar with the idea of the Dark Ages, it's a popular view of the history of science. The Dark Ages view has a few central points, which include the claim the Christian church repressed science for 1,000 years. That is, Christians squashed science right up until the Enlightenment, and torturing and burning any heretics who dared to go against Christian dogma. The central message of the Dark Ages is no science happened in the Middle Ages. Instead, the Middle Ages were a time of stagnation and suppression. That's why they're called the Middle Ages. They're in the middle of two good things. And so you can see why the alternative world presented in Family Guy seems so attractive. Wouldn't we all want to live in a world where science progressed for 1,000 years instead of being stifled? Wouldn't you love to live in a world without the Dark Ages? Flying cars are just the beginning. Now, we all know that comedy TV is probably not the most reliable place to get your history from. But the thing is, it's not just Family Guy that longs for a world without the Dark Ages. Lots of us here might know and love Carl Sagan, the renowned scientist and author, and he addressed the history of science in one of his books called Cosmos. You can see on the slide, he presents a timeline of the history of science. And can you see the huge gap in the middle? At the bottom of the timeline, he notes that this 1,000-year dark age is a poignant lost opportunity for the human species. That's because, as we've mentioned, the Dark Ages view holds that no science happened in that whole millennium. Of course, many others, including popular science writers and the new atheists, echo this story. And it's a compelling story. It's the story of rationality, open-mindedness, and truth at war with religious dogmatism. It's the story of darkness and enlightenment. It's the story of the ancient war between light and darkness. And who wants to be on the side of darkness? Don't we all want to be defenders of light? But before we sign up to this story, let's interrogate it. Let's see if it stands up to scrutiny. After all, testing theories to work out whether they explain the facts. Now, we already heard from Family Guy and Carl Sagan, but those aren't really historians. What do historians think about the history of science? Of course, as with any academic discipline, there's a whole variety of perspectives. But there's been a recent consensus that's been emerging among historians of science, and I think it might surprise you. The Cambridge historian Seb Falk writes, "The idea of the Dark Ages peaked in the 18th century, but as historians developed a new appreciation for the brilliance of medieval culture and learning, the term Dark Ages began a steady decline." This is the emerging consensus among historians. The Dark Ages are not Dark Ages at all. Christianity and the Church did not repress science for 1,000 years. This Dark Ages story is simply a popular myth, but it's a myth that continues to be peddled even by great communicators of science. Now, you might be wondering how this story is still so popular when it's not supported by scholarship. The American science historian Michael Shank speculates that writers like Carl Sagan got their ideas from science popularizers before them and didn't really bother to fact check them. And tonight, we're going to do some fact checking. We're going to take a quick tour through the Middle Ages to see what historians say about the emergence of science. We're going to be unpacking the untold history of science. The real irony is that this history of science isn't really untold. It's been told in hundreds of journal articles and academic books, but it's still not been told a great deal to the general public. So we're going to look at three aspects of the emergence of science in the Middle Ages. Firstly, the translation of Greek and Arabic works in Europe. Secondly, the world of medieval universities. And thirdly, we're going to meet some of the scholars who did early science. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to see the way that Christianity and science have built each other up and the way past Christians have modeled good ways to engage with science. But before I dig into these points, I'll just note that I'm using science in a bit more of a broader sense tonight than it's normally used. The scientific method didn't really crystallize until the end of the Middle Ages, but there's generally a recognition among historians that it couldn't have emerged without a lot of similar study that kind of preceded it. And so for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to call this science because it does involve a close and systemic study of the natural world. And it was also interchangeable with terms like philosophy or natural philosophy. So there'll be a little bit of overlap with that language. All right. So part of the Dark Ages story is that Christians have always been closed-minded and dogmatic. A.C. Grayling is a well-known British philosopher, and his book on the in his book on the history of philosophy, he gives weight to the Dark Ages story. Writing about the rise of Christianity, he says, "The Christians took the fallen stones of temples to build their churches and overwrote the manuscripts of the philosophers and poets with their scripture texts. It's hard to comprehend, still less to forgive, the immense loss of literature, philosophy, history, and general culture this represented." This is one of a whole litany of accusations that A.C. Grayling levels against ancient Christians. He talks about how priceless philosophical texts were written over the Bible, if not just vandalized and burned. Now, it's not clear whether the events that Grayling describes were widespread or even happened at all. However, critics of the medieval church were right to point out that there was lots of learning going on elsewhere in the world. A whole group of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars translated Greek works into Arabic. They also wrote their own works on philosophy and science, and together these books made up what's called the Greco-Arabic heritage. Now, if you were to buy the Dark Ages story, you might be tempted to think that these dogmatic European Christians would burn and tear up this great compilation of pagan and Islamic thought. But in fact, quite the opposite was true. Scholars in the West heard of these books. For these scholars, the thought of reading them was positively mouth-watering. They were so hungry for the knowledge in these works that as soon as they became available, Christian scholars began the epic task of translating them all into Latin. One such translator was Gerard of Cremona, who lived in the 12th century. We know about him because one of his students wrote a little biography on one of his translations. And this biography is very helpful because it tells us a bit about what Christian scholars thought of the Greco-Arabic heritage. The biography describes Gerard traveling to Toledo in Spain to search for a book by the Alexandrian mathematician Ptolemy. When he arrived in Toledo, he was overwhelmed by the scale of learning that was unavailable to the Latin West. His students record his reaction, writing, "There in Toledo, and regretting the poverty of the Latins in these things, he learned the Arabic language in order to be able to translate." He regretted the poverty of the Latins. He got straight away to the work of translating. By the end of his life, he had translated more than 70 works, including books by Ptolemy, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen, and many others. His students recorded that he wanted to show the Latin world, as if to his own beloved heir, whatever books he thought finest in many subjects as accurately and plainly as he could. And I think this is a really beautiful picture. Gerard of Cremona wanted to pass on to the Latin West his favorite Greco-Arab works because he loved them like his own beloved heir. Of course, Gerard is just one example, but he is one of many translators in Europe who felt keenly how intellectually impoverished the West would be without the Greco-Arabic heritage. This is also reflected in their response to the newly translated works. Aristotle was one of the thinkers that Gerard laboured to bring to the West. And Aristotle's works were received with great enthusiasm, even though he was a pagan. For example, medieval Christian scholars simply referred to Aristotle as the philosopher because of their immense respect for his work. The Italian poet Dante had such a high regard of Aristotle that in Inferno he couldn't bear to put him in hell. How does this compare with the image of dogmatic Christians vandalizing the work of pagans and infidels? Well, it's a completely different story. These Christian translators were not just open to pagan and Islamic learning. Many of them, like Gerard, devoted their whole lives to making it available to the Latin West. They weren't just open-minded. They had a deep passion for knowledge, wherever it came from. And I think they serve as a great model for how Christians can engage with scientific knowledge even today. But more on that later. This passion for learning and knowledge is one thing, but so far the only science we've mentioned is the work of Greek and Islamic scholars. Were scholars in the Christian West more than just translators? Did they contribute uniquely to the growth of science? This brings us to talking about medieval universities. I don't think I have to convince any of you that universities are important for learning. Today, universities are the unchallenged centres for higher learning and science. Some of you might have studied at university, others might have even taught at university. But what were universities like back in the Middle Ages? Well, the author Richard Carrier has a few things to say about that. He writes, in fact, universities at that time tended to be highly conservative and resistant to the new innovative methods and ideals of scientists that led to the scientific progress for 1,000 years. These are bold statements, but Carrier is not alone in feeling this. There are a lot of people who have the impression that medieval universities were more interested in burning heretics than studying the natural world. Medieval universities are often depicted as restrictive and dogmatic, as well as being mainly interested in theology. And this view fits nicely into the Dark Ages story that Christian scholars were anti-scientific and closed-minded. But is it true? I want to tackle this question by pointing out three features of medieval universities. Firstly, they were historically unique. Secondly, they did study the natural world. And thirdly, they were sponsored by the church. Schools of learning were popular in ancient times, famously in ancient Greece, but many historians agree that there was something quite unique about the universities that began to form in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. They weren't just schools where students could learn from a famous master. They were more like educational guilds. Guilds were beginning to pop up a lot during the Middle Ages as tradesmen gathered together to demand legal rights. Latin scholars often travelled far and lived in cities where they had little or no legal standing. It seemed natural for them to form guilds like the tradesmen around them. So they were granted special status by the church and recognised by local authorities. Higher education became institutionalised and the university was born. So these universities were unique. But what did they actually study? Was it all just Christian theology? Were they, as Richard Carrier put it, conservative and resistant to innovation? You might be surprised to learn that science and the natural world were a large part of what was studied at these universities. The historian Michael Schenk estimates that about 30% of the curriculum was related to the study of the natural world. Fewer people in these universities studied theology because it was considered too sacred for just anyone to study. Most of the people who came through university actually studied maths, science, or philosophy. Instead of being restricted to Christian learning, study in these universities was mostly based off the Greco-Arabic heritage. Over centuries, hundreds of thousands of students were taught Euclidean geometry, basic astronomy, and the cutting-edge biology of their day. Contrary to popular myth, scholars at Latin universities dissected human bodies to broaden their knowledge of human biology. They also taught that the Earth was spherical and had a deep passion for astronomy in general. They designed instruments to measure the movements of the heavenly bodies, such as the astrolabe and the albion, depicted here. Instruments like these were immensely sensitive and complicated, and show the skill of Latin scholars when it comes to astronomy and engineering. There wasn't just study at these universities, but also discovery. For example, Nicole Erasmi argued the Earth was rotating, and his contemporary, Jean Buridan, broke new ground in the impetus theory of motion. As early as the 1300s, the monk Dietrich von Freiberg solved the problem of primary and secondary rainbows with a simple experiment. This is just a little taste of the intellectual progress washing over Europe's universities from the 1200s onwards. So it's looking like medieval universities were actually pretty good. There was innovation occurring, and they were studying the natural world and learning from non-Christian works. But can we give any credit to Christianity and the church for this? It seems like we can give at least some credit to the church. We already saw that they granted special status to universities as they did with guilds of tradesmen. Beyond that, the church provided an immense amount of financial and social support to universities. For this reason, the historian John Heilbronn, no friend to the church, estimates that the Roman Catholic Church is the single greatest benefactor of science in all history. The historian Edward Grant also points to Christianity's unique conviction that church and state should remain separate, rooted in Jesus' teaching to pay taxes to Caesar. Grant sees this separation of church and state as the reason why universities could gain special status from religious and political authorities. There were also theological reasons why Christian Europe provided a fertile ground for universities, but we're going to get into those in our next section. So we've seen that universities in Latin Europe were pretty unique, that they were supporting innovation, science, and general progress in human understanding. And we've seen not only did the church provide direct support for universities, but it also had a hand in shaping the social and political landscape that birthed them. What does this tell us about the Dark Ages story, that these universities were restrictive and conservative and killing science? As Michael Shank puts it, if the medieval church had intended to discourage or suppress science, it certainly made a colossal mistake in tolerating, to say nothing of supporting, the university. So what's up with all those stories you hear from science popularizers about censorship? Where does all this heretic burning and scientist martyring come from? Means the only example of these Dark Ages parables. Well, I want to be honest that there were some pretty regrettable moments for the church. People were really burned as heretics, and we can look back at that terrible reality, and we can learn from it. However, the idea that scholars were persecuted by the church for their scientific views is in most cases untrue. If you look into prominent cases like the trial of Galileo, you'll soon notice that these events are much more about ego clashes than they are about a war between science and religion. And many times they were also much more related to what scientists thought about astrology rather than astronomy. And when it comes to universities, there's the accusation that they censored and restricted what was available. Strangely enough, despite how much medieval scholars loved him, Aristotle was even censored a few times. But this didn't actually have much of an impact on the intellectual freedom of the university. That's because, apart from the fact that lots of scholars simply ignored the censorship, they were only enacted by local groups. Any scholar displeased with the censorship in one university could simply move to another. I love this advertisement from the University of Toulouse when Aristotle was banned in Paris. It reads, "Those who wish to scrutinize the bosom of nature to the innermost can at Paris." Toulouse wanted to attract good scholars from Paris and took the censorship of Aristotle as a good opportunity to do just that. You can see how it would have been in the interest of local authorities not to attempt any censorship if they wanted to keep on their best scholars. Now we've looked at the translators and the universities, it's time to meet some of these medieval scholars. How did medieval scholars think of science? What motivated them to study the natural world? Were they Christians? And more importantly, did Christianity encourage their science? There are some common answers to these questions, which are well summarized in The God Delusion. In his section on Newton, Dawkins writes, body until significantly, I think, the 19th century, when there was less social and judicial pressure than in earlier centuries to profess religion. This is a popular view of medieval science. These scientists claim to be Christian because otherwise they get in trouble. Being a scientist is not associated with religion in the minds of people like Richard Dawkins. So an assumption is made that these scientists either secretly didn't believe in Christianity or simply didn't care. Moreover, Dawkins definitely excludes the possibility that whether they were Christian or not, their science was shaped by Christian convictions. To put it simply, any science that happened in the Middle Ages had nothing to do with Christianity. Tertullian, an early Christian theologian from Carthage, is famous for saying, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" Athens represents the heights of Greek learning, in other words, early science and philosophy. Jerusalem is obviously the birthplace of Christianity, and in Tertullian's mind is associated with Christian theology. So Tertullian is saying, what does Christianity have to do with science and philosophy? Nothing. You could say he sounds a bit like Richard Dawkins. And people have seen this as an admission from the Christian side that Christianity is either opposed to or completely separate from the development of science and philosophy. But as the American science historian Edward Grant notes, Tertullian was far from representative. Other early theologians were much more important to how Christians viewed philosophy and science. Clement of Alexandria and his student Origen pioneered a way of reconciling Christianity with Greek learning. They rejected Tertullian's idea that Greek philosophy was irrelevant. Instead, they saw Greek philosophy as good or bad, depending on how it was used. It was a source of truth, and they believed Christianity to be the ultimate truth. So they had faith that if used correctly, philosophy would lead to truths that accorded with their Christian worldview. These early Christian theologians and their disciples described science and philosophy as a handmaiden to theology. Like a handmaiden, it wasn't the main deal, but it provided an important service. St. Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in all of church history, also had this view. He encouraged the study of science and philosophy, albeit with a couple of caveats. And the works of these early Christians show that they actually put this handmaiden understanding to serious work. Basil of Caesarea was another massively influential theologian from around the same time as Augustine. He wrote a commentary of Genesis which made extensive use of pagan science to describe the natural world. Basil's book is an astonishing summary of Greek learning about biology and astronomy. And Augustine followed in a similar tack with his own commentaries on Genesis, which are brimming with descriptions of the natural world according to ancient science. Importantly, Augustine's commentary also included a stern warning not to reject scientific truth because of one particular reading of the Bible. In fact, Augustine and Origen's commentaries on Genesis both took a figurative view of the first chapter. Later Christian scholars showed a similar enthusiasm for theology's handmaiden science. Scientists during the scientific revolution were excited to discover the wonders of the natural world because they were thinking in a Christian framework. Francis Bacon, who's a noted pioneer of the scientific method, talked about God's two books. I'm sure you can guess what one of those books is. It's the Bible. The other book, though, was Nature. Bacon and his colleagues believed that the natural world was made by God and it might reveal important insights about God or even moral lessons. One result of this is that they were extremely motivated to study nature. But there are other, even deeper implications of this view of nature. And these implications went on to affect even non-Christian scientists. Think about books. Books have structure and order and fundamentally meaning. They also have beauty and elegance in how they're put together. What is it like to view nature in this way? How does this view of nature as God's book affect the people studying it? Well, it can be difficult to quantify what kind of difference this would make. But I think we can detect a few subtle hints of the impact of this view of nature as like a book, ordered, structured, imbued with meaning and even elegance. Some of these hints come from modern physics, and surprisingly, from scientists who weren't Christian. Albert Einstein himself was certainly not a Christian, but you might say that he was inheriting a certain view of nature from Francis Bacon and his time. And that view of nature bore fruit in Einstein's famous theory of general relativity. Now, I don't know that much about physics myself, but I'm led to understand that it's quite surprising how Einstein came up with general relativity. What's really surprising is that he seemed to arrive at it by intuition. It wasn't based on experimentation or strong experiential evidence. The chemist and philosopher Michael Polanyi describes Einstein's discovery in some detail, noting that it was a bit of a slap in the face to those who have a strongly positivist view of science. That is, the people who hold that science must be based off experimentation or experience. Polanyi writes, 20th century physics and Einstein's discovery of relativity demonstrate, on the contrary, the power of science to make contact with reality in nature by recognizing what is rational in nature. Notice Polanyi's emphasis on the strangely rational nature of reality. This lines up with the view of nature as having been designed and ordered. The physicist Eugene Wigner expressed a similar feeling. He was amazed, as many physicists are, by the astonishing power of mathematics to represent reality in a really useful way. He said, "We are in a position similar to that of a man who is provided with a bunch of keys, who, having to open several doors in succession, always hit on the right key on the first or second trial. Like the person opening doors who always strikes on the right key seemingly by accident, Wigner is a bit suspicious. He's recognizing something rational in nature that scientists are building on." Let me provide another, maybe more controversial example. Many people take Charles Darwin's theory of evolution to be a blow to the view of an orderly and rational universe. If it all just unfolds by chance, where's the rationality in that? But in actual fact, there's reason to suspect that Darwin's view was indebted to the idea of a rational universe. He wrote about his own theory: "I'm inclined to look at everything as having resulted from designed laws, with the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance." It's very interesting how Darwin references designed laws. Again, we have a scientific breakthrough with someone recognizing a deeper rationality at work in nature. In fact, many of Darwin's contemporaries, including scientists and clergymen, did not see evolution as a blow to the Christian view of nature. On the contrary, they saw in evolution a way that design and purpose could work themselves out, um, according to natural processes, but under God's providence. This idea of the world working according to natural processes, but possessing a deep God-given rationality, can also be seen in Isaac Newton's work. Remember, we began with Dawkins talking about Newton. Now, Dawkins made the implication that Newton only claimed to be a believer for practical reasons. Is that right? Well, Newton certainly wasn't an orthodox Christian. He had some pretty unusual beliefs. But when it came to science, Newton was obviously motivated by his religious views. He wrote extensively about this, and in particular, he wrote, "All variety of created objects which represent order in the universe could happen only by the willful reasoning of its original creator, whom I call the Lord God." Writings, this same idea again, that there's a foundational reasoning or rationality underlying nature. Our world is fundamentally ordered. And Newton believes this about nature for the very simple reason that it is a book that God wrote, that it's made by God. So we can see that Dawkins didn't get Newton right. The implication that any science that happened in the Middle Ages had nothing to do with Christianity, well, that's simply not true. The historian Edward Grant summarizes it nicely. "Latin Christianity provided a sympathetic environment for the sustenance and advance of natural philosophy and science. Medieval Christianity showed it was prepared to do more than merely tolerate its existence. It actively promoted natural philosophy in an open and public way." The story of Christian scholars shows that there was a direct connection between science and faith. Their science was shaped, intentionally or not, by their Christian worldview. Now, we've taken a fast tour through the history of Christianity and science, and along the way, we've looked at what a lot of critics of Christianity have said about this history, and seen that their statements are often unconvincing on a deeper examination. Now, I want to stress that this has been a very fast tour. Haven't been able to explore a lot of the nuance, and also haven't been able to explore some of the things that happened that were quite negative in this history. We've just been myth busting the idea of the Dark Ages, and because of that, I've focused on some of the positives in the Christian history of science. But there certainly were negatives as well, and they also sort of deserve coverage in other areas. But what are we going to do with this history? What can we learn from it? Well, I think there are three ways that people often think about Christianity and science. And I think the history of Christianity and science has a takeaway for each of them. First, there are people who think that Christianity and science are locked in conflict. People like A.C. Grayling, Richard Dawkins, and Richard Carrier. And if you have that perspective, I think the history we've seen tonight should challenge you to give up that view. The Dark Ages are a myth that science historians no longer accept. Christianity was often the benefactor of science, both financially, socially, and theologically. Simply put, Christians weren't anti-science. Secondly, there are people who think that Christianity and science don't conflict with each other, but they're in totally separate realms. There's no crossover. Even some Christians I know who are deeply passionate about science would hold to this view. For this perspective, I think history shows that you can be more bold about connecting science with your faith. Hundreds of years of Christian history testifies that science is deeply satisfying when viewed through a Christian worldview. And follow the example of our forebears in looking for surprising areas of resonance. For example, think about Bacon and even Einstein and Darwin and Newton. Christianity and science weren't kept completely apart. Thirdly, there are people who believe that Christianity and science don't contradict in principle, but that Christianity contradicts with secular mainstream science. People holding this view would often hold a literal view of Genesis 1 and that the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. But I think history can also provide some context for this view. Christians throughout history have been very open to pagan learning. Remember Origen, Clement, Basil, and Augustine. All these Christians and theologians believed that non-Christian science could be an aid to faith, a handmaiden to theology. They believed science and philosophy are ways to the truth. And if Christianity is the ultimate truth, then it will stand up to interrogation. It will be able to be reconciled with the study of the natural world, whoever it is that's doing that study. These are three takeaways that I think we can draw from the history we've looked at tonight. And I think they should push us towards the position that Christianity and science are not in conflict, but can build each other up and learn from each other. This is a rich and rewarding understanding of Christianity and of science that's borne fruit throughout history. I'd like to finish by saying one more thing about the Dark Ages. Most of the books I read on the Dark Ages said not only was it a myth, but it's a surprisingly Christian one. That's right, the image of knowledge as light and ignorance as darkness and an ancient battle for the truth, that's an image that harkens right back to the Bible. Now, I began by saying that we all want to be defenders of the light and of the truth. Well, the Bible encourages us to be defenders of the light, but not of some oversimplified Enlightenment ideal, but of the true light, of the true ground of reality and knowledge. Christianity teaches that God has been doing battle with the powers of ignorance and darkness long before the new atheists were, and he invites you to join in on that battle and be defenders of light and truth and knowledge, whether that be scientific or spiritual. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Declan. You could stop sharing so we can actually see everybody.
Sure. There are just some books that I sort of referenced on the topic.
Right. Right, very good. I'll just see if I can bring gallery up. Move the gallery. Yeah, that's got quite a few here. All right. Now we'll just go through some of the comments. Just on the recording, was I got distorted sometimes. Did other people have the same problem?
Yeah, there was some distortion.
Yeah.
Yep. At different points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a problem going over the nullarbor, isn't it?
Imagine if there were trees there too.
Yeah. I put in a comment here, if science was never actually suppressed, was it encouraged or practiced? I think you've actually answered that already, because you're saying that it was encouraged or practiced. And but on the other side, like one of the problems with reconstructing the New Testament is getting access to early Christian writings, because various people like Diocletian actually wanted to get control, confiscate and burn Christian writings, and that was actually done. And so he was actually trying to remove evidence.
Yeah, and
And
it's not to say that that never happened. Like, I'm sure there were instances where, books were burned and that sort of thing. I mean, Christians nowadays, there are still sort of some Christians around who do that. But it certainly wasn't anywhere near the extent that it's sort of blown up to be by
yeah,
lots of people. Yeah.
I think one could argue that there was more the other way around. And if you actually looked at the activity, likewise, Hadrian destroyed a lot of sites and put temples on top of them.
Yeah.
So, so there's a lot of activity in the other direction. He had his reasons, but there was a lot of activity there.
Yeah, and I think that's another point that is often worth making, in that sometimes, obviously there were instances where Christians might have burned books, or that temples were destroyed and that sort of thing. But I don't think it was ever really a simple case of they hated science and they wanted to get rid of it. Often there was, like, it might not have even had any sort of scientific or theological motivation. It could have been a political thing. Like, often the history is just a lot more complex than putting into that kind of Dark Ages framework would have you believe.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the film The Name of the Rose?
I've read some of the book, yeah.
Because that actually depicted a very conservative attitude from monks about endless recapitulation, and so a deeply conservative approach that was kind of suppressed any new types of thinking. But that's kind of an image. Of course, the hero was what's the name of the guy?
Sean Connery, is that?
Yeah, Sean Connery. That's it. Was trying to uncover and work things out, and against heated opposition from within the monastery. But yeah, anyway, what were your thoughts on The Name of the Rose?
Oh, I quite like it. I think it's
Yeah, I thought it was a great film. Yeah.
yeah, it's a fun narrative. And I think even in that book, and yeah, you can see that some of the monks and stuff like that, including the main character and his mentor and that sort of thing, they actually do know quite a lot about philosophy, and they do have, like, yeah, there's some deeper learning kind of underpinning it. Certainly the depiction of that particular monastery is pretty conservative and apocalyptic and whatever. But yeah, it's a story.
Yeah. Yeah, but some people would kind of think that the conservatism was the norm.
Mm.
What factors accelerated science post? That shouldn't be post Kepler. Earlier than that, the post Copernicus.
I think I'm not, so that's not sort of what the focus was. Yeah, I think if I had to make a call, I think you get to see that, yeah, the scientific method starts to really crystallize at that point. A lot of what people have kind of been doing gets sort of sorted out and structured a bit. And I think as a result, that leads to a huge kind of growth in science. Also, I think some stuff I've read points out that scientists started to talk to each other, like across universities, across countries. There was a lot of like cross-pollination occurring, which really accelerated the process of doing science and that sort of thing. So yeah, probably a lot of things, including, yeah, I think a lot of things that were already kind of developing, sort of getting paid off. But yeah, those are a few things that I've heard.
How about the scientific method, the use of experiment, was an innovation, or
Having more literate people and having the printing press would have sped up information getting around, people thinking together.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. How about the construction of cathedrals? Construction of cathedrals preceded the 1600s. But they're quite a impressive engineering feat. Are they kind of evidence of practical science being implemented?
Possibly. I'm not so sure about about cathedrals themselves. One of the books that I read on it spent a lot of time talking about I think it had a picture of them, the astrolabe and the other one, I can't remember what it's called. Like the astronomical devices are generally regarded as being like some of the best examples of how advanced their sort of understanding of astronomy and engineering was at the time.
Kevin, it's Joanna from Sydney, in case I haven't
Hi.
met people here before. Why do you think construction of cathedrals is an activity reflecting science?
Well, they had to do calculations, civil engineering calculations to make the whole thing stand up and not fall over. Yeah, well, that's my main thought. Like engineering is a scientific activity.
I mean, the pyramids are pretty impressive, and they're from a long time before any of that. So humans have always had a really
They
pretty
did
good
like they
stuff.
experimented with different types of architecture, like Romanesque and Gothic, with their flying buttresses and all that sort of thing.
I suspect even the way they built the buildings, you know, what tools they used or methods they used to get the bricks up there or the whatever they're using, that would have to be some scientific principles involved. Would they have used pulleys? Probably.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Another interesting feature on that one is I was in Armenia some years ago, and they have what they call Armenian niches in their huge churches. Armenia is subject to earthquakes, and lots of buildings get wrecked by the earthquakes. And this was a special design that they had used that sort of mitigates the seismic waves, and the churches weren't affected. They all kept standing for hundreds of years just because of that clever architectural feature.
Wow.
And Armenia is a Christian country.
Yeah.
Can I just add a comment, being an architect? We have a bit of a stereotype view of some of the ages. So when we talk about the Dark Ages, when you're talking about construction, there's a lot of wisdom and experience in craftsmen and tradies and architects over many centuries that were passed down. For example, the Romans were using concrete, which had amazing properties way back 2,000 years ago. And we're only now discovering why it was so brilliant. It's got incredible resilience, and a lot of its structures are still crack-free. So what I'm trying to say is there is a culture in every age where there is wisdom of building and knowing materials and how everything goes, but we don't always give credit to it. The same with the pyramids. I've done a lot of research on that. And some of the earliest pyramids are better than the later ones, showing that the intelligence with the Great Pyramid, for example, still cannot be done today. They asked a Japanese building company with expertise, could you build the Great Pyramid today? They said, no, we couldn't, not with the same accuracy and the way it all fits together, showing there was a brilliance much earlier. So my plug on this, being a supporter of Genesis, is we've got to get the model that a lot of information comes out of Noah's family, who were smart people, smart cookies, who could build big super tankers in timber, and their knowledge of metals was there in the building of the Ark, in the building of the Tower of Babel. So we're not starting with the evolutionary argument of a whole lot of primitive people getting smart. We start with smart people who over the ages learned a lot of things.
The human brain is subject to the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
Joshua made a comment here. Does modern day science challenge or go against Christian teaching more than it did in previous centuries?
I think we missed a question that Joanna had. Not sure if you
Yes.
want to. Yeah. About like an elevator pitch to respectfully challenge the view that, yeah, the Dark Ages and that sort of thing. I think I'm not quite sure what a really good one would be, but I think sometimes the sorts of people who make that challenge are the kinds of people who really listen to like academic learning. And so even I've just said at times like, look it up, like the majority of sort of specialists in this field no longer accept that view and say that that's an outdated and sort of incorrect view. And I think someone who is making that challenge often does want to be on the side of like academic institutions and that sort of thing. And so actually pushing them on that and not saying it's not just some Christians who are like, oh no, you got it wrong. It's like actually the whole sort of discipline is kind of now has a problem with that. Yeah, I've found can be an effective way to push back. You can also go like in on a specific example like Galileo and say, well, actually, it turns out, Galileo was only put under house arrest and it was only because he called the Pope Simplicio or whatever. Give a specific example of how, yeah, there's this one particular narrative presented and that's actually not true. But yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, your question on does modern day science challenge or go against Christian teaching?
Thinking about content rather than in principle.
I think that's a good question. I'm not quite sure. I mean, someone like Aquinas and stuff like that, they're dealing with Aristotelian views that like the universe is eternal. And so there's actually quite a significant challenge there that doesn't exist now, right? In that now, however long you think, sort of secular scientists believe in the Big Bang Theory that everything sort of had a beginning, and that our universe had a beginning, which was not something that was sort of common sort of scientific understanding a long time ago. I think probably the big thing is evolution, in that I did note a few times how, yeah, people sort of at the time didn't see that as being as much of a big conflict as I think it can sometimes now be seen. But it's also not like if you do take evolution to be true, understand like lots of Christians don't take that to be true. My personal view is that I do. But if you do take evolution to be true, it can be sometimes difficult to see areas of resonance, or there can be issues to sort of figure out about how sort of suffering and the image of God work and that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, each age has its own challenges. We have ours now. I mean, now we have a lot of the data about fine tuning as well. The universe is sort of incredibly fine tuned for life, which challenges a sort of a naturalistic understanding. So yeah, I guess every age has its ups and downs with scientific knowledge and what might be sort of validating or challenging to the Christian theology up until that point.
I think medicine, if you put that in the science arena, that today is probably moving into that realm of, question. It's ethical. It's the ethics in science which complicate things. From a Christian point of view, you wouldn't do it, but it's heading in that direction in some different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, bioethics is a whole other question. Yeah.
Joanna, would you like to actually, yes, I agree. I'd been imagining the Faculty of Arts and Social Science in thinking on this question. Would you like to expand on what you said?
Sure. So I guess I think maybe Declan's covered a bit of these. Like in Joshua's question, one way of interpreting it is science, like, science as knowledge and then the systematic process of gathering knowledge, does that conflict with Christian teaching, or do the people who do that, the scientists, conflict with Christian teaching? And I would, so I was, oh yeah, so when I wrote that comment, I was probably like, so I work at university. I'm in the more health sciences, biology area. I don't have a problem with evolution and biology, but I think the people who work in the arts have, I don't know, maybe the nature of their of the way they apply their science would probably challenge Christian teaching more than people in, say, the physics departments or maths.
Yeah, I'd say that maths would be pretty neutral, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, coming back to the ethics comment, I mean, how do you use science to tell you what is the correct ethical approach?
You can't.
You can't do experiments. Yeah. So, like, and I had a related comment further down that I agree with your summary on what Polanyi is saying. It's all like positivism is all language. The newer term is, some people might call it scientism, but it's the idea that science explains everything. But science can't explain the assertion that science explains everything.
Yeah.
So you kind of the assertion undercuts itself by the very nature.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the comments about elevator pitch. What's that about?
Yeah, so Declan, your talk was good and detailed, and I think we learned a lot from the detail. I guess the intersection at where we live and operate. I think I think most people in this meeting are Christians. Partly why we're here. But I think we interact, yes, we interact with people in both sides. So people inside the church and outside the church. And people from either of those areas could have the thinking that Christians oppose science in medieval times. Without having Declan physically around to give a rebuttal if someone comes to you with that. And as that view, the question was, how do you, in day-to-day conversation, or when you're at dinner with people or with friends, how do you respond to that? That's where I was coming from. And like, we're not going to be able to give a presentation like Declan, but I think at the grassroots levels, we need to find better ways to respond. Because my
question was different. What's this got to do with elevators and pitch?
Elevator is just an analogy of like a 30-second moment that you have going between floors as a response to someone. Yeah.
It's a slang? Or
elevator pitch means giving your arguments in half a minute kind of thing, or explaining your product or your idea or whatever it is in a short amount of time.
Because you only have a short amount of time to get it across.
Soundbite?
Yeah.
The word.
Oh yeah. This is probably an inflammatory question. How should we interpret Genesis? What was the author trying to say? So, because that's where a lot of the argument and conflict comes from, as well as other passages in the Bible. But what do you think the writer's intent was in writing about the creation?
I think I'm not an expert on it. My personal view is that I agree with what John has said, that it tends to I think I would not read Genesis as being a scientific account. That's not to say that it's completely unrelated to history. Like, as Christians, we still believe God did create the world. I think some of the better interpretations I've heard would describe it as like cosmic temple liturgy. So like, it's liturgy like what you'd say in a synagogue or a church, and it's inaugurating the cosmic temple, the universe. And that sort of people get that from comparing it to a bunch of other similar kinds of texts and seeing what it's doing with that and what it's saying. So, like, one of the things that's really subversive about Genesis 1 is that every sort of other creation narrative, the gods do their work of creation, which is often quite violent. The Genesis is very orderly. And then they'll go and rest in their temple. But in Genesis 1, God just rests. And the message seems to be the whole of creation is made by God and is God's temple. It's this like epic view of God that you just don't get in sort of other contemporary accounts. And so, yeah, I like that kind of reading. You can get that in, there's a book by John H. Walton called The Lost World of Genesis 1, where he does a bunch of sort of historical and like language analysis to try and kind of work out what it's really saying. And he does also sort of apply that to the science debate and say what it is and isn't saying to that in his view. But yeah, so that's the sort of view I would lean towards. But yeah, I haven't read the original Hebrew. I'm not an expert, so take it or leave it sort of thing.
I have an opinion for which I could be burnt.
Yes.
Happening already. It sometimes appears to me as though they're kind of using the cosmology of the day, but putting a monotheistic reinterpretation of it.
Yeah, that would be similar to what the cosmic temple view is. It's using the sort of genre tropes of a particular kind of creation narrative to say, well, we believe in this kind of God, not these kinds of gods that your creation narratives are about.
Like with the dome or whatever, I can't remember the detail. So that might have been a common characteristic of ancient cosmologies, but
I haven't heard anything like that from anywhere else.
Sorry?
I haven't heard anything like remotely like that from anywhere else.
Oh, okay.
The Genesis account, you mean, Brian?
Well, what Kim was talking about with the dome over the earth, or however it's expressed.
Firmament.
Yeah, different translations express it differently.
All right. Yeah, it was not my strong point anyway. So I won't push it with any sort of dogmatism. There's a comment. Joanna, did you want to expand on that comment about Polyani?
I probably said that from before, that the view that it's said different ways, but that science explains everything can't explain itself.
Yeah, interestingly, this is actually, this is a reasonable faith group. I'm not sure if you guys have been reading William Lane Craig's new books that he's releasing, The Systematic Philosophical Theology. They're quite heavy. But he makes the point in the first one that part of the reason we've had such a renaissance of Christian philosophy recently in the last 40 years might be that the sort of logical positivists tried to kind of get rid of metaphysics because they're like, well, the way they think about language and truth and that sort of thing, they're like, the metaphysical statements don't mean anything. And so they kind of tried to get rid of it. Then they kind of collapsed when people realized actually that principle can't verify itself. And then it left the door open to Christian metaphysicians to sort of take over academic institutions. And now we have this huge renaissance of sort of Christian philosophy from people like Craig and Plantinga and Swinburne, a lot of other guys like that. So yeah, interesting kind of historical thing.
Sorry. You continue, Joanna, if you're staying on that theme.
I thanks Declan for the summary. No, I haven't read, but it does look attractive. But then I don't know whether I have the headspace for it. But I think Francis Schaeffer makes the same point, that they continue with the positivism for that time, and then it folded on itself. And left the way open. Like they worked out that it doesn't work.
Yeah. There were comments about Newton, but Newton did quite a lot of religious writing. I've been told that he wrote more on the Bible than he did on science.
Correct.
And I've actually read what he wrote on the book of Daniel, which was quite extensive, and it's brilliant. His knowledge of the Bible is extremely impressive, considering he didn't have electronic search tools. So I would say he's definitely not giving lip service.
Hmm.
Yeah, he believed that he'll be remembered for his theology, not for his science.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was hoping for that. Yeah. You mentioned that you didn't have time to or didn't include negative things in the what Christians did in relationship to science. Would you like to kind of make brief comments about them now?
Yeah, I can. Um, I think, yeah, there certainly were instances where Christians, like I said before, did destroy temples and things. Books were burned. A lot of it was to do with the particular political context that was unfolding, but there were cases where people had that attitude, like Tertullian, of, yeah, we don't like secular learning. So, Christians are human like everyone else. So there were those kinds of incidents. I think probably the worst instances of church history that I didn't include as much that would fit into that kind of Dark Ages narrative. So there's obviously the Crusades is a big one in that it's often historically misunderstood, but even when you do understand it in its correct historical context, still not very good. Still pretty horrible on the part of Christians. And the Inquisition, again, is another one that's often exaggerated and not put in context. But even when you do put it in context, still something that's, really horrible. Charlemagne's persecution of the Germans is another one that kind of comes to mind, although that one was stopped. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of sort of obviously horrendous, historic abuses that Christians have done and even do in the present. That might fit if you just focused on them, took them a bit out of context, they might fit with your kind of Dark Ages view. So yeah, I think it's worth looking at that. John Dixon's book Bullies and Saints has a really like even-handed approach to that, I think, where he sort of covers, I think he starts with the Crusades and he covers some of those really negative things, which he would call like Christians have been bullies. But then he also points out how the whole direction of Christian history is moving sort of against that. So yeah, I think that's a really good book on that sort of topic if you want to look further.
Yeah, because I'd say some Christians do have an anti-science attitude. So I just kind of write it off. Scientists say this, but I know what I believe, and that's the attitude.
I suppose that's one thing that I've seen discussed on Facebook is when people say trust the science, they're actually saying a bit more than that. They're saying trust what the mainstream scientific opinion on this point, or trust what the official scientific experts have said. And so it's not so much about, science can mean a few different things. Plenty of people will say the scientific method is good, but it's about the particular findings, what the mainstream view is at the time, and often Christians in our age are among the skeptics of the majority view in some topics.
Yeah, and I think being skeptical is can often be a really good thing. I mean, that's what drives scientific discovery. Every scientific theory we have now was once a minority view. I think there are Christians who have very particular and precise kind of scientific questions about like mainstream sort of accounts of science. And yeah, I think that's definitely worth investigating. I think my own view is that I just don't think we're pressured into questioning mainstream science based on Genesis. I don't think we're forced to do that. But if people have genuine questions and they can make a good argument for them, by all means, I think argument discussion is good.
I think because some scientists who unbelievers may make antagonistic statements about Christianity, and so Christians can react in a defensive way.
Yes,
Yeah.
also that,
Sorry, you go, Eric.
through the popular view of a lot of people is that is that science and Christianity are at odds, and so even though, yeah, I mean, amongst Christians there's a range of views about evolution, but it's with a lot of non-Christians that assume that, oh, modern science has disproved all that. And so you have, when John Safran was door knocking in support of atheism, when he was door knocking Salt Lake City, I think he was carrying around the book of Origin of Species. That's kind of what non-Christians are assuming that the standard Christian view is.
Yeah.
I think it's a standard characteristic of human nature that if we hold anything dear, whether it be a political view, a football team, or meaning of life, if something comes against it, we have this knee-jerk reaction and reject it and don't even consider anything to do with it. And so there are some Christians like that who consider that science has attacked Christianity, so therefore science is evil. So they reject science.
Yeah, I've basically gone through the chat comments, so feel free to depart from the chat conversation and bring up any additional things you'd like to.
I feel like sometimes that that Christians or even, well, just your standard person in the street is like years behind what some of the scientific evidence or that the scientists are saying themselves. You know,
Yes.
for example, the theory of evolution has actually been put on the table as having big questions. You know, all the big, heavy, scientific conferences, they're all at a stalemate or a position where they can't answer significant questions. But people don't know that, right? They don't know that we can't explain the Big Bang, right? They don't know that we can't explain first life. They don't know that we can't explain why humans are exceptional. So those 3 points are stymieing the heavy scientific community, and it's not getting any easier for them. In fact, it's getting harder for them to actually confront that. That even that African American, can't remember his name now, the one that's been very antagonistic and towards Christians.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yeah, he's even got to the point where he's said, we just can't answer these fundamental questions about evolution, and that there's massive big holes in it. You know, we don't have the transitional species evident. We can't. It just doesn't explain it. So, yeah. But the person in the street is like 30 or 40 years behind that type of discussion. They don't read it, you know, especially Australians. Australians are very ignorant, you know.
Well, the average person in the street went to school 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, but they're just not even interested, you know.
But even so, there are things in science textbooks used in schools today that have been proved to be wrong scientifically.
That's right, they have. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it can be really important to strike a balance there. I think, you're pointing out really rightly that a lot of atheists, or even, you know, in some cases believers as well, might have a kind of faith that the story that we currently have from science about humanity and the earth and that sort of thing is completely fixed. Like, it's fine, guys, we got it. And actually, it's not. Like, there are still lots of questions.
Yeah.
I think I'm sensitive to sometimes these statements from like scientific conferences and that sort of thing can be like put out of context a little bit, in that I think the majority of secular sort of scientists would still say that they are like 100, like that they are sure that evolution is the process by which humans and sort of various other creatures evolved. But there are questions that the theory still needs to answer about how that happened. So yeah, I think that would probably be more in context kind of what's being said there. But I think it's a good point.
But of course, that particular perspective comes a lot from the belief that we don't like the alternative explanation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question and comment, Declan, on the issue of science, and you're hinting at it with the debate on evolution. If you take scripture as God's spiritual revelation to humanity, it's very clear from the very start to the very end that all through is weaved, as well as all the human factors and what we would explain by science, is a power is at work doing miracles, defying all the laws of science as we understand them, and creating outcomes that cannot be explained by science today. And, we're all familiar with the stories, but, crossing the Red Sea, the damming of the Jordan River, the things happening in Jesus's ministry with healings and a whole lot of stuff, showing, I believe, there's another level of science, which is godly, does operate with rules and criteria, but it's a godly agenda which the human mind cannot totally come to grips with. And the conclusion at the end is it says that it's all heading to a new heaven and a new earth, where the current heaven, which is a reality in another higher dimension, has to be reunited with a renovated earth. Now, the physics and energy involved in such a process is nothing that any scientist today could give a model for or an explanation. So we've got to accept that scripture teaches God's laws operate in different levels, and we're very preoccupied with the current levels on our current earth, but there is another bigger picture. And of course, the non-believers and the atheists will pooh-hoo it all, but we've got to see as Christians, that is what God says on the topic. There is another dimension. So there is an answer to death. There is a resurrection. It doesn't make scientific sense to a medical person, but with God, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's one. I think there are like two sort of ways that people generally approach that, and one is, like you've said, that God is using processes that are embedded in our universe that we don't understand, and that are far beyond us. The other way that people sometimes talk about it, and I'm not sure what sort of which one is true, is that science is sort of almost by definition description of what happens in a closed system. And so if you're a Christian and you say, well, what about the resurrection? Well, science is saying, well, dead humans stay dead in a closed system. But if we're not in a closed system, and if God chose to intervene to raise a body from the dead, that would also be consistent with science. There's a really good discussion of this in Alvin Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, where he talks about like Newtonian view of sort of scientific reality and the like more sort of recent developments that have kind of pushed back against that, and argues how both views are consistent with miracles, but even the newer sort of scientific understanding to do with like the quantum realm and that sort of thing, which I'm not even going to get into, how that might even be more consistent with a God who works miracles. But yeah, it's a really fascinating topic.
Could you just clarify what is meant by closed and open systems?
Yeah, so a closed system is sort of just like saying all other things being equal, if it was just natural processes at work, this would happen. So, if it was just natural processes at work, your body would decay and you wouldn't come back to life. That's a closed system thing. But that's presupposing if it was just natural processes at work. If God is actually at work, then it doesn't contradict science to say, well, he could actually intervene and bring someone back from the dead.
Because I think open and closed systems might be
Schaefer.
refer to another aspect or be thought of in different ways, such as with the laws of thermodynamics, that entropy always increases in a closed system, but it's got nothing to do with God or no God.
Yeah.
I think the language of closed or open systems, well, I first read about it in Schaefer's writings, but it's not a scientific theory. It's more like a philosophical view. So the better comparison would say be between naturalism being the closed system and theism being an open system. And it's not that in theism you don't have natural processes, but in theism, natural processes are not all there is. That there is someone outside of the natural processes who can act through them.
Yeah, it's just a terminology can be used in different ways.
I think deism is kind of a halfway house between the two, that believes the universe is a closed system, but there is a God outside of that closed system who can't interfere on what goes on inside.
Yeah.
And I think it was someone did right. Deism was kind of a stepping stone towards atheism.
Right. Okay. All right. So, anybody got a burning question or a comment?
Well, on your point, Kevin, my comment is with Genesis, Moses was very familiar with the Egyptian view of creation, being a educated man under Pharaoh's system. So he was familiar with the ancient world view. But when he's over in Sinai, he has this encounter with God, and we read about it in that terminology. But what we have to see is his information for writing Genesis came from a revelation. And who is the person that he sees at Mount Sinai when it says he met with God up on the mountain and spends 40 nights up there, and then later on he's in the tent of meeting and doing amazing things? The thing is, it has to be seen as Christ. It's Christ that's speaking through the burning bush. It's Christ who comes down on the mountain, but not in human form. But he's coming fully as a person, understandable, able to be spoken to, and Moses can speak to him. And all the information to write Genesis early accounts is a God-given instruction, not Moses getting smart and trying to put it in more modern idiom. He had to get converted from the Egyptian view into the biblical view, and it came through Christ relating directly to him. So he changed his perspective totally.
Okay. At this stage, I'll wind up the recording, but while it's going, I'd just like to thank you, Declan, for an interesting presentation, and the discussion was particularly lively, which is a great indicator. So
Thanks,
I will just, if I can work out how to do it, I won't stop the video, that won't work. Stop recording.